the Bench to Market Talks, where we're going to talk about why culture is everything, looking at a European versus a US healthcare market perspective and how to break into them. I'm going to talk about Dr. Beth Harrison in just a second. First of all, though, I do want to remind everyone who's watching that Biolocity does have their applications open for the 2025 or 2026-2027 cohort. The deadline is December 1st, so utilize this UR code or email us at biolocity@godtech.edu to get more information and to apply. Also, keep note that we have a lot of amazing talks this year. We have brand new speakers that you haven't heard from before. Make sure that you subscribe to our email distribution list so that you can register. You can also go to our website, to the Bench to Market page that this QR code will take you to, and you can register there as well. Additionally, the point of these is to educate you, the people who can attend on this day, but also to be able to create some evergreen collateral for the community long term. And so we do have a YouTube channel. Highly recommend that you go ahead and subscribe to it. We do have curated playlists on different topics that will help you along your commercialization journey. Additionally, we want to hear from you. We want to share any news that you have. We want to showcase any success that you and your team have had. So you can go to our website and select to send that information to us. So if you utilize this QR code, you can send it to us or email us your success stories or your interest in how we can improve to that biolocity@gatech.com. Again, why don't we dig into Dr. Beth Harrison, and I will tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Harrison is a strategic leader with deep global expertise across healthcare, medtech, and organizational transformation. She was educated in the US and Germany and has led enterprise turnarounds, driven business development, and shaped public affairs and market access strategies for medical device and diagnostic companies across Europe, North America, China, and Sudan. She has over 3 decades abroad. She directed hospitals, startups, foundations, and academic programs at leading universities in Italy, Germany, and Norway. In 2018, she returned to the US as CEO of the North American headquarters of a German medtech firm, where she reconstructed the organization and portfolio for long-term success. She now partners with Boling and Company to launch a boutique consultancy supporting German and French firms establishing operations in the Atlanta region. Welcome, Beth. I'm going to allow you to take over the screen share and share your presentation.
Thank you so much, Angela. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So I am going to bear with me now just for 1 second, and I'm going to try to pull up my presentation. Thank you. Right. Are you able to see this? Is
Yep, looks
everyone able
great.
to see the presentation?
Yep,
Okay,
looks great.
great. All righty. I'm just going to move this sidebar so that I can see my presentation now. All right. So thanks again, Angela. I mean, when I hear this introduction, I think, geez, that sounds old. Um, but what I've learned throughout my life is that, it really doesn't matter how old you are in the chronological age, but it really matters how much you let your experiences shape you. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to share some of my experiences in cross-border transactions, but also talking about culture, because I have spent, as Angela said, the majority of my life actually in Europe. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, and then moved to Europe to go to graduate school. So you can imagine some of the lessons that I had to learn when I was learning the language, as well as just how to get around in these different cultures. Let me start with a question. I think I'll start with a question. Here we go. All right. What is the number one reason that cross-border mergers fail? Now, with cross-border, what I mean are two companies that are in different countries now. So what do you think the number one reason why cross-border mergers fail? Well, I'll tell you, it's about culture. It's because of cultural incompatibility. And to be honest, the miscongeniality award goes to Daimler Chrysler. Daimler Chrysler tried to make a huge merger work for about 9 years. And one of the problems was really the corporate cultures that were of these two companies that were trying to come together. First of all, Daimler, very formal, so a German company, formal, very hierarchical, very conservative, very engineering driven. So perfection is everything. And their planning cycles are very long term. Now, try to marry that to a US company that is very informal or was very informal in some of the structures, very creative, fast moving, but more important than almost anything else is they were more risk taking, had a much more risk, I guess, affinity that I would say than the Daimler group. Now, they could not integrate. This was just a major and very expensive disaster. They couldn't integrate because the decision-making processes were not compatible. Even the way they did budgeting or even product development, the philosophies, there was mutual suspicion with employees. It was just a really, really bad thing. And so what happened? Well, eventually the whole company, this very promising merger, dissolved. So miscongeniality, don't know about that one anymore. So what's the deal? Well, one of the deals in this, or a lot of the issues in cultural incompatibility, and why I'm focusing really on culture today and many aspects of culture, both from a country, a geographical culture, but also a corporate culture, is that there was just a mismatch of speeds. Now, this is sort of like a pattern that I've seen in many cross-border transactions. There's a mismatch of speeds. One company wants to go fast, they just can't get it out quick enough, and the other says, let's wait, let's make sure this is right. We need slow, slow, slow. It's the tortoise and the hare situation. The other is the decision-making differences. You know, how you make decisions within a company, a country, whether it's top down or consensual, that also plays into the speed mismatch, but it's extremely important. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have tried to get brilliant ideas across in your own companies or in your own academic institutions, and you're realizing, doesn't quite work like I think it would. And it's probably because you were thinking top down, you're the decision maker, and your organization is thinking, well, we got to get a consensus on this. It's just a small example. One of the really big things is that the values conflict. You know, some companies and some countries are known for their innovation. You know, I think about Scandinavia when I think about a lot of innovation. I think about the US versus a country or a company that's more interested in stability. There's also the customer centric versus the engineering centric, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many things that are about the values that when these conflict, these are basic things. And it's one of the things that is often overlooked with this euphoria of what would a merger do? What would a startup, how would a startup work in another country? There's also that lack of shared identity. You have to kind of get people on board and to realize that you're working towards one goal. And usually when you've got two companies coming together, they have their own us versus them mentality. So it's us against the world. They don't appreciate us. So there are also national cultural differences. And you know, this is particularly something that I've seen a lot in transatlantic mergers. But even within the regions of a country, there are cultural differences, as we all know. I mean, you can hear from my accent that I was born in the deep South. Well, I'm living in Boston. So you can imagine some of the differences here in the way we approach, the way we speak. Not even to mention the differences in speaking with Germans, with a different sort of language clip and speed. But in healthcare, remuneration systems are almost always the silent killer. But we've been talking about mergers. Um, how important are these cross-border transactions? I mean, why do we spend time talking about this, about the problems with cultural integration? Well, mergers actually represent a quarter to a third of all global M&A activities. So there's a lot of money going into mergers. And the three major areas, and this is what interests us predominantly in Georgia Tech, is the technology and healthcare are the most active sectors, followed by the financial sectors. So there were just the IT related deals, the healthcare related deals, the merger of both of those types of the health tech, tremendous volumes. Now, this has increased in the last couple of years with a lot of glitches. I mean, COVID was obviously a difficult time. 2008, don't have to mention that one again. And even the average deal size fluctuates with a lot of the economic conditions. But some of it has to do with, is this in pharmaceuticals or is this in a mid cap or a small or a startup? So we've got ranges of deals from a couple of million to a couple of billion. So, but just know that there are hundreds of major healthcare mergers that occur annually on a global scale. So this is a big problem. But the biggest problem is that there's so many of these, a lot of energy goes into this, but 50 to 70% of these deals fail and they just don't meet the objectives. Now, some of the objectives could have been cultural integration, or it could have been because of regulation or reimbursement problems that they failed. But 50 to 70% is a lot. And the number one cause is culture. Wow. Well, what about startups? I mean, is the situation any different in that? Well, in the early 2020s, there were just dozens of European companies that were coming out. This was kind of new. You know, in the 2010s, there was not that much. By the early 2020s, even in spite of COVID, there were a lot of health and life science startups that came in from Europe. Now, a lot of the digital health players were big. So like Babylon, Benevolent AM, Sword Health, that sort of thing. But the startups that were coming in from Germany were basically the majority of them were backed by government-backed accelerator programs. So these were companies that were enrolled in accelerator programs, much like what we know very well at Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia. Sorry, Angela, had to mention it. I do have nothing on that's red though. Um, so
It's okay. I
government-backed
have
accelerator
editing
programs.
ability. I can clip that. We didn't hear
Uh,
UGA.
I'm sure you have selective hearing on this one. So interesting enough, now I'm going to focus a little bit more on Germany just because I'm kind of partial, because I lived there and worked there very deeply in that environment, and as well as many other European countries. But Germany was kind of like my second home. So 50% of the German startups were trying to enter the US shortly after their founding, but actually only 19% were operating there within 1 to 2 years. Now, what generally happens is that you've got a startup in Germany that will try to get its feet on the ground, try to proof of concept and that sort of thing. And that's what the accelerator programs do for these German companies. And then they'll come over to the United States. But there's some other reasons why it takes so long and why we really don't have any good statistics about the success rate. But the major inhibitor, when you talk to these companies, and when you talk to many of these German companies about why aren't you coming to the US? Huge market. What's the deal? It's because it's a lack of intercultural knowledge and experience. In other words, they feel just insecure. We're going to talk about insecurity and risk in a few minutes. But I want to delve into what do we mean by cultural incompatibility? Well, and that's what we're talking about, basically, cultural incompatibility and how do we get over this? Because it is a major, major issue in cross-border transactions, startups, and just global integration. Let's look at, first of all, what is culture when we're talking about culture? Well, I like to say it's the sum of everything we take for granted. So, in other words, it's the things that we don't have to talk about, but we just assume. You know, do I go drive on the left? Do I go on the right? Well, of course, a lot of these things are regulated, but I don't even think about it anymore. Do I hold the door for elderly people who are older than I am, or not? This is part of our culture. Yeah. But it's also how society is actually organized. Let's get some of these differences that create difficulties when we're looking at cross-border transactions. One is that culture is the organization of economic life. So it's the embodiment of our belief about markets. For example, we could have unbridled capitalism, where we have Adam Smith. You know, as an economist, I always go back to Adam Smith and the invisible hand of the market. So, in other words, everybody maximizing their own utility will maximize the utility of an entire society. Well, we're somewhat more critical now than we were in Adam Smith in 1776 when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. There's another organization. It's called the social market economy. Now, this is mostly seen in European economies. especially in Germany, where the solidarity and the subsidiarity principle are ruling. So, in other words, look out for the common good and not to from each according to the needs, but watching out for the levels of poverty, the weakest in a society, but using market mechanisms to solve problems. So, in other words, not redistributing by fiat, but using market mechanism and the allocation of prices, the allocation of access to determine the structure of the economy. And then there's the other spectrum, socialism. Now, please do not get socialism with social market. Do not confuse socialism with social market economy. I'll start turning green, I think, if I hear you do that. Socialism is that everybody shares burdens and benefits equally. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about in European and American societies is this mixture, this sort of continuum of capitalism and the social market economy and how the two interplay. So you think they're very compatible, but actually, because of that organization, they bring about different priorities. Now, another thing is, sorry, the culture in the terms of is it an individual or a collective focus? Now, I mentioned that in the organizational markets. So in the US, we tend to say it's very rugged individualism. We have these myths of pioneers and cowboys. We all know they're kind of myths, actually, but they're the things that are our hero's journey, basically. And it's kind of the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. In other words, find your way. And there is the ability or the environment that you can do this. It's very hopeful. And it's built based on actually everything that was centered around or leading up to the Declaration of Independence, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with uncertain, alienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then there's the Constitution that delineates basically the balance of power. Now, contrast that with the law of the land in Germany, where the society concentrates on protection and preservation of the collective. So, in other words, post, it's Oktoberfest. So, the basic law is the Constitution of Germany, basically, but we call it the basic law because it's not a constitution. Now, look at two things here: personal freedoms. Article 2, every person has the right to free development of his personality. Not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it also limits that as insofar as it does not violate the rights of others or offend against the constitutional order or the moral law. We don't see that in the U.S. Declaration of Independence or anywhere in the Constitution. The other thing is that everybody shall have the right to life and physical integrity. Ooh, interesting. Freedom of the person shall be inviolable. And these rights may be interfered with only pursuant to law. So, in other words, there's a caveat that also feeds into Article 6 that says, and this is really kind of funny, every mother shall be entitled to the protection and care of the community. Really kind of a collective community delineating the rights. And this was written after the Second World War, where a lot of the personal rights were eliminated. So laws are sometimes a reaction to historical facts. Let's look at some more things when I'm talking about culture. One of the strongest predictors of success or expansion failures is the risk culture. And risk cultures really matter, and risk attitudes matter because you have the same innovation, but you're going to have different adaptation patterns. We talked about the differences in speed of cultures, for example. You can have the same startup, and there's a different scale trajectory. Do you start small? Many European companies do very limited prototypes or pilot projects, and then they grow big rather than having a large pilot project and adjusting along the way. So there's same investment, but there's different failure risk. But there are so many cross-border misunderstandings, and these are expensive. So German investors, especially the institutional ones, tend to value sort of a proven track record. So and also proven traction. So in other words, technical robustness, engineering perfection. You've seen all the car films where you talk about German engineering. Um, it's actually true. That's sort of a point of pride for the society. And investors value profitability over growth. Now, contrast that with US investors and especially venture capitalism. They look for growth, for speed. They look for the market fit. So, in other words, are you capturing a large part of the market? Because it's your footprint that really matters. Because this means that you're going to dominate, and you can dominate prices, strategy, customers, and they also look how are your goals. So, in other words, if you think about, I watch Shark Tank regularly, the US version and the German version, and it is incredible. So, in the German version, you have a too ambitious goal. The first thing that happens is you get cut down. If you say the global market, they will not listen. You go into the United States, they're looking for large markets because that's what the US is about. And that's what most people are interested in. Come into the US markets, it's the largest, the vastness of the market. When you look at risk again, so I'm looking at kind of the 5,000 feet view of this whole thing. German culture is a risk minimization culture. So there's strong cultural preferences for don't rock the boat. It's engineering, so it means you've got certainty. Now, this is not to disparage any of you engineers. I'm very, very attuned to the biomedical engineering faculty in the College of Engineering, anyway, at Georgia Tech. But it's almost engineering as a goal in and of itself. So even in the school system, they emphasize perfection. So many of my German friends, if they don't speak English perfectly, they will say, I do not speak English. I can't tell you the number of times I've gone on travels with many friends, and I don't speak any languages other than English and German. But they will send me to order everything in French. And for God's sake, I don't speak any French, but they speak perfect French, but it's not perfect. They say it's not perfect. So this is the idea. It's so embedded. And so even in an entrepreneurial environment, the ones that break away are the ones that are really, really brave and are very bold and robust and strong. But they have problems breaking through their own cultural upbringing because failure is a stigma. If you're bankrupt or you declare bankruptcy in Germany, you are banned from holding a bank account for the next 7 years. There is always full disclosure of everything for 7 years. There's a huge stigma. Trust that with the United States. Failure is seen as a badge of courage. It's fail fast, fail forward, learn fast. So we have a growth mindset here. So it's a much more a risk acceptance culture. Even in the regulatory environment, the medical and life science sectors are shaped by regulatory conservatism. So, in other words, do no harm, not the environment of the United States where you try to find out what you can possibly achieve. So, there's preference in Europe and in Germany for incremental, evidence driven innovation rather than political disruption. And, in the US, we love disruption. Our US founders are expected to attempt disruption. We're looking for bold ideas, long shots. We're looking for aggressive scaling, so growth, and entering large markets very early. Because as I said, the beauty of the Americans is that the markets are large and not they're a lot more homogeneous than a European market. So Germany has 84 million people. United States, 340 million, 360 million, something like that. So all of the EU is almost the size of the United States, but each country within the European Union, the EU, has its own regulatory environment, even though there is an overseeing body that's the European Union. So you can imagine why the United States is just such an appealing market and European markets less appealing for American investors. But there are some really interesting things in these European markets for us as Americans. So when we're looking about risk, I mean, this is just a fundamental part. It's really, I can't stress this enough. It's not just the language or the willingness to learn another language, to not disparage people who do not speak perfectly. It's about the willingness to step out when you're kind of leaping into the darkness, like Søren Kierkegaard said. Faith is a leap into the darkness or into the abyss. So Germany, the average founder age is a little bit younger than in the United States because in Germany there's a lot of a safety net. If you fail, then you could go back into your previous employment. You could take a hiatus, you can take a break. There's a tremendous social net. The United States, you kind of got to be sure you know what you're doing. So in other words, you got to have a lot of experience under your belt to make sure that it's going to be successful. But it doesn't mean that you're less risk averse. Actually, in the United States, there is no safety net when you step out and you form a new company. So it's a little bit safer in the environment in Germany. It's a lot scarier, but the age tends to be a little bit older in the United States. So it's really all about them. So in Germany, there are high barriers to entry. If you are a founder, you have to show your experience, you have to show your funding. Well, that's why a lot of these funding or these new companies are trying to now break into the United States after they've done a small pilot program to come into the United States and expand into the United States. Because in the United States, there is that early exposure to entrepreneurship that makes us all a lot more willing to accept. There's a high failure rate, and really, it's just about trying. What's your next step? So in Germany, founders tend to be experts, not generalists. And in the United States, we have a lot of role models and mentoring systems. So in other words, you don't have to be an expert, but you have to know who is. It's not about who you know, but it's about who knows you and how you can access some good resources. So older founders aren't less risky. So when we look at this and we say, 42 to 30, it's just that they calculate risk differently. So let's look at what happens in a culture and what our opportunities are, because this gives us a big key into how we can broach markets. One is that in Germany, they validate extensively before there's a launch. And in the United States, we launch early and we just iterate. It's that continuous iteration, continuous improvement cycles. We have the short cycle improvement. It's not so in Germany. Get it as perfect as you can get it. Test it as much as possible before you actually launch it. Don't tell them how you're going to launch because it could be a failure. That's not good. So it's slow to scale for that reason. It's very, very, very careful. It's a risk averse society. And in the US, it's just go as fast as you can. Germany, profitability over aggressive growth. And in the US, it's expand early, burn capital, grow, raise it again, expand again. So when you're looking at expansion and expansion plans and this culture of coming into the United States versus the United States going into Germany, we see a lot of international expansion of American companies, often in years 1 and 2, because we're looking at a global market. This has to do with large companies as well as small companies. Again, being careful that culture, sometimes the overestimate or the underestimation of the barriers that come from culture, regulation, understanding remuneration models are often kind of swept under the rug with our kind of happy-go-lucky mindset. We're going to make it and we make it big, kind of the too big to fail mentality. Whereas international expansion in Germany is usually after year 4 or 6. Some of the companies that I work with now have really been in their planning phase and in their careful launch almost 4 to 6 years before they risk coming into the United States. But when they come, they know what they're doing. So just briefly, there's very heavy regulatory emphasis in Germany there. And there's the European regulations and then there's every country's regulation. And in healthcare, there are a lot of regulations that have to do with who has access to the market, making sure that the budgets are not overextended. So in other words, there's price regulation, there's quality product regulation, there's market entry regulation. And in the United States, we don't see that as much. Sure, we have our certifications. If you're going to be a physician, you have to have board certification. But when you look at products and even the barriers to entry, certification you've got to pass. You got to go through a lot of hurdles, but it's an individualistic thing. It's in Germany. It's more regulated. Let's don't overspend ourselves. Let's not oversaturate the market, or let's not undersaturate the market. So, United States, when we're talking about regulation, we're focusing more on FDA, lanes for innovation. In Germany, we're talking about it at every level, or in Europe, in every level. So it's not just products, it's also budgets. So Germany and in Europe, you have the clinical evidence that's expected immediately. And in the United States, we use adapters in academic medical centers. So early adapters are rewarded. Um, there's a lot of venture money in the US, especially for early adapters. Once you can find an early adapter, sort of a captured market, so to speak, that you can play around with, then expand heavily and use leverage the contacts you've made. And these are accelerated by insurance companies that join with you if you're in the healthcare or the health sciences. So if you can get a health insurance company to help you with a pilot, almost doesn't matter how big the pilot is, it accelerates scaling. In Germany, there are a lot of limited or independent practices. So you don't have a lot of these conglomerations of medical centers. I ran the second largest public hospital system in Germany. We had six hospitals, but we didn't have a very extensive outpatient market because it's so segregated. So this is what you face in the German market, a lot of independent practices. So you have limited early adapters, because it's that I can't afford to lose the customers or the patients that I've got. So the regulatory mindset is really, that's kind of the risk culture that we're talking about. So as I said, in Germany and in Europe, it's worst case prevention. Just let's it's always worst case. If you're doing any board presentations, you always present the worst case and you call it your best case. In the US, it's always the best case opportunity capture. So in Germany, um, I worked with many companies in Germany that did not really want to be the first of their kind because they were afraid of some of the problems that would arise from early adoption, from imperfections in the product, from copycats. And if you've spent so much money on the regulatory to be able to go to market, then you don't want to have that sort of prevention, or you don't want to have that sort of hindrance to be when that sometimes happens when you're the first of the kind. Whereas US, that's what we want. In Germany, one of the major prohibitors of innovation, when you talk to young companies that are now really eyeballing the United States as their opportunity, is the high bar for data protection. We talk about our data protection, the HIPAA laws, but it is nothing like German data protection. I have all of my apps, my health apps on my phone. In Germany, when I show this, it is unheard of. There is nothing like that. There are closed systems, but there is nothing like an app on a phone, even though there's a new regulation in Germany that says that if an app passes all the regulations, it will be reimbursed by the entire insurance company. So it's a completely different type. Oh, I see I have a question playing music. I am in an airport lounge, so sorry everybody about some of this background noise. But anyway, so what we're talking about is this risk mind. The regulatory mindset is part of the risk culture. So in other words, it's boiling down to, are you willing to make mistakes? And what happens if you do? What's on the line? So I did a talk one time about failure and about how in the US you're taught just to keep going. I mean, the major thing is that you don't stay down. Whereas in Germany, it's please avoid any failure because of the terrible consequences. And I mentioned some of them: bankruptcy laws, buying a home, getting a long-term loan, even renting an apartment. You will have major difficulties to rent an apartment, even if you have declared bankruptcy once in Germany. In the United States, it's difficult, but there's a quick reset because we all accept that. So investors in Germany, and there's not a lot of venture capital. When I did my dissertation on venture capital in Germany and venture capital in Europe, it was a very, very thin dissertation. because it was back in the 90s. If I had done it at the same time in the United States and looked at all the number of venture capitalists, it would have been tremendous. And it has to do, this plethora of venture capital, the dearth of venture capitalists, has to do with ideas of risk and the attitudes of risk. So investors prefer no loss over high gain. And for that reason, they're very conservative. And we have very, very many smaller funds, technology funds, think tank funds, accelerator funds that aren't the scale. They're not looking at the scales that we practice. And they don't practice as much, or they don't preach as much commercialism as we do in the United States. Now, the companies, the German companies that are successful in coming over to the United States are ones that have gone through these accelerators that promote commercial viability. In other words, they mock or they imitate the American programs of mentorship, going through the cycles. I know, Angela, you can sing a couple of songs about what Biologity is doing, and we see this in many of the programs. And this is what Germany has been lacking for a number of years, and it's just now playing catch up. So in Germany, it's quietness. It's not the loud American market hawkers. If startups look like they're going south, they pivot very slowly, cautiously, and they shut down quietly. In the United States, pivots are normal to be expected, and you're trying to look for a buyer actually to get you out of the mess you've gotten yourself into. So these attitudes lead to funding cultural differences. There's the conservative due diligence of Europe, the slow pace and the technical focus, and this rewarding ambition, fast moving vision, mission, traction in the United States. So fundraising rounds in Germany tend to be smaller, a lot of grants, as I mentioned, and in the United States, they tend to be much, much larger, and much more complicated. So the behavioral consequences for founders and for boards are that in Germany, if you're going in front of a board, or if you're going to a VC or any kind of investment community and doing a pitch, you under promise and you over prepare. So as a German, you're reluctant to oversell some kind of vision, because vision is what I think it was Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Germany after the Second World War, said, vision is something that I have at night when I sleep. In other words, a nightmare. So you're concerned about negative press, and you build solid technology, engineering, but perfection. In the United States, easily prone to overpromise, just to kind of set that story. What could we achieve? Go west, go east, go for the gold, shoot the moon, shoot for the moon. Don't shoot a moon, shoot for the moon. So there's a sales first fundraising culture in the United States. So in other words, sales driven. Founders are comfortable. I mean, what's been going on in media recently? We're comfortable talking about trillion-dollar companies now. And Americans go to market before there's a perfect product. You will very rarely see that in Germany. And if it happens, it's because they're preparing a market entry in the United States, because it's a lot more forgiving here. So when Germans go to the US, they've got to be bolder. It's hard. It's hard. You have to kind of shake them and say, be bold, get to the point, hear what's going on, address this need, get excited, show your excitement, lead with vision. Just don't underestimate yourself. And when Americans go to Germany, we tell them, you've got to slow down. You cannot be so enthusiastic. You have to be really show evidence, be founded, be grounded. And you need credibility with clinicians, and KVs are not venture capitalists. These are the regulatory bodies that govern physicians and how many physicians are allowed in certain areas, as well as what can be charged and what the budgets are for any kind of treatment. So The reason a lot of things fail in some of these cross-cultural things and cross-country and cross-border is because there's the tendency that we all have basically to copy paste. If it worked here and it's a good idea, why doesn't it work somewhere else? Well, let's dig a little bit deeper. First of all, risk is a key feature in the US, and risk is a liability. So you can't copy paste. It's if something is a sort of marginally risky in the US, it's not a big deal. In Germany, that's a red flag. So failure tolerance, cross-border translation, not copy paste, risk attitude, not the technology, explains the biggest differences in startup outcomes across the Atlantic. So in healthcare, these cultural differences are huge. First of all, in the United States, we've got an individual health focus. We're market driven. There are many fragmented markets. When you think about many, when you think of yourself as a patient, do you always know where you need to go? Do you know who's governing what? Do you know who to call? Well, in Germany, you know. It's population health focus also, which means that you're looking at the good of society. So, in other words, vaccinations are a big issue. Um, there's universal health care, so it's a matter of protecting the society by protecting each individual. So that means being transparent and everyone knowing where to go for treatment, being able to access treatment anywhere, not if it's in what is it called, in network or out of network. That concept does not exist in European markets. We do not have insurance intermediaries in European markets. So in other words, there are national price controls there, and these price controls have to do with how much insurances will pay, but also how much can providers charge. So in other words, it is a complete transparency, and there's no middleman there. So there's not a lot of what we call skimming in the European markets because the margins are so low. There's just not a lot of cream. So in other words, what insurance companies are charged for the services of providers is highly regulated because providers aren't allowed to charge more for their services. It may cost more. That's the challenge of management in European environment. It's a cost-oriented focus. So it's not just expanding your customer base or patient base, because the more patients with a limited budget, it's less money to go around. So in other words, you focus on keeping people healthy and out of the system so that the money you do have can be used for the patients. Now, there's not a lot of room for innovation. As I said, running a hospital is a big challenge because how do you get innovation in if you have low margins? Most of the hospitals in Germany are public hospitals. So which means that there's not a shareholder value type thing. And if you do make money, you have to reinvest it. There's just never enough money for innovation to go around. So for that reason, governments have to step in and finance innovation and bail hospitals out or bail out healthcare systems if they're not able to afford the innovation. U.S. high cost, fast cycles, investor appetite, and then risk aversion in in European markets. Now, if we look a little bit deeper, what are some of the differences and where do we see opportunities? Because whenever I look at differences in markets, I look for opportunities. So, U.S. hospitals, an amazing amount of overhead costs. 25% of the costs are administrative overhead. In Germany, it's 11.6. So here, there's an opportunity to cut administrative costs in the US by using new technology. So this is where a German would focus and say, hey, wait a minute, we do it 11.6, and we have substantially better outcomes. Mortality and morbidity, our healthcare costs are lower. This would be a good opportunity for German ingenuity in the form of apps or even Cerner, which is one of the healthcare providers for electronic patient records that was older than Epic. So it's an opportunity to get process-driven administrative overhead. The U.S. overall system. The administrative share is about 7.6 of the budget. In Germany is 4.8% of the budget. So in Germany, practitioners spend 16 to 19% of their time on administrative tasks. I could not find how much time practitioners spend in the US because the US market is so fragmented that sometimes practitioners are defined as physicians. Sometimes there's nurse practitioners, sometimes physician assistants. What we can say is that in spite of, or even with the 25% administrative overhead costs, and Germans spend less than 20% of their time on administrative tasks, and these are the medical professionals. Even if you add that together, we're still much lower in the administrative costs. In other words, there's a lot more efficiency in processes in Germany. So the US has a substantially higher share of cost related to administration to Germany. So there is an opportunity. And it's about comparing priorities as well. So if the United States, if you've got 16 to 70% of GDP spent on health, you'd think, oh, that's a big priority. It's 12 to 13% of GDP in Germany, maybe not such a big priority. Well, we start looking at the cost here. You look at, for example, adjusted hospital expenditures per capita in the US, $2,600 versus in Germany, roughly less than a half. Couldn't that account for the percentage of GDP? Well, hospital and inpatient care, looking at the approximate share, 30 to 37% of total health care spending, whereas 26% of the total, and the outpatient care is approximately 25% of that. These are the different priorities that there are in the US and in Germany. So the US spends more absolutely per person and as a share of the economy. And there's a smaller share of healthcare spending, but the implication is that the price level and the utilization in the US are higher for roughly similar services. So let's look at cost drivers. So these usually give us an opportunity when you're looking at what are you trying to solve when you enter into a market. Why are you there? Just to create a market or to solve a problem? Much of the problem globally in healthcare is the cost. So the difference in the cost is driven by really higher prices rather than the greater volume of care in both countries. So pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, physician wages, administrative costs, all that costs a lot more in the United States. I was shocked. Last time I had a CT. So in Germany, I will pay approximately $350, maybe $400 for a CT, and I can get them fairly easily. In the US, it's anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000, depending on the environment, and that's for an inpatient CT. Very difficult to get a lot of gateways, a lot of intermediaries to get to a diagnostic. Germany, there's a lot more emphasis on getting a lot more diagnostic up front rather than along the way. This is one reason why the healthcare costs can be lower in Germany than in the United States. Also one reason, but we've got many cross-border transactions in diagnostics in European markets rather than in other areas of European markets. So the average cost per patient, let's look for a coronary bypass, just to give you another measure. Well, if you look at Medicare, the US, it's about $44,000. Looking at European nations with similar healthcare outcomes, access using wealth insurance, it's roughly half of that too. So German healthcare costs are about a half to two-thirds the cost in the US. And I won't go into the mortality and the morbidity of it in the interest of time, but very impressive health outcomes. So in other words, when you've got low margins, you've got capped budgets, the U.S. investor or a U.S. company going into German markets is not going to be interested in expanding the coverage or the amount of patients or attracting new patients. In other words, the market footprint is not going to be a successful model in European healthcare, but it is in the US healthcare. So again, the cultural contrast, US is speed. The European is consensus. The US is decision making, it's owners, it's risk taking. And in Europe, it's lean organizations, it's stability. Don't rock the boat. Looking at even contracts. Oh my gosh, contract negotiation. Some of the worst and the most difficult that I've done have been in China, but some of the most tedious, where I'm pulling my hair out, have been in European countries. So detailed, so slow cycle. It's this strict compliance. It's almost an obsession. Whereas in the US, it's fastable. You try to get a memorandum of understanding out. It's return on investment driven. So it's investment driven. Huge contrast. So in wrapping this up, I've covered a lot of ground, and I hope I've shown, or at least sparked some interest of where entrepreneurship can be successful in the US and what kinds of entrepreneurship in healthcare markets and what in German or European environments. But transatlantic success, it's not about cut and paste. You just can't transplant a business model. It's about understanding the complexities of two vastly different systems and ways of thought. And, I've seen so many good ideas, and they don't fail because they're wrong. They fail because of the lack of cultural understanding. There's not a mastery of a system. There's an impatience with the detail. Well, the devil is in the detail. The devil is in the nuances of culture and why ideas thrive and why risk thrives. So innovation is it crosses borders easily. There's just a wonderful permeable membrane with innovation and people are excited. But unfortunately, the way innovation is reimbursed, the regulations around it, the culture of acceptance or not, um, doesn't cross borders easily. It's a success, and I want to kind of leave with this thought is that success belongs with teams that can bridge all three of these. This culture, understanding that there's not one right market. Um, it's not one right way to do things. So your good ideas can be very, very useful in other markets if you're willing to adapt them to fit into the cultures and the acceptance. The transatlantic healthcare is not a gamble. It is a strategy game. And if all of you know, as all of you know or may know, I'm a game theorist and I'm a strategic thinker. So healthcare, transatlantic healthcare is a strategy. If you know how to play the game, you will succeed. So thank you very much for your attention today. I hope I didn't go too quickly. And Angela, I hope everything was heard the entire time.
This is amazing. So, a few reminders. First, this was recorded. We will upload it to our YouTube channel. I put into the chat the links to the YouTube channel, also the links to subscribe to our distribution list. Dr. Harrison was also a guest on my podcast where she talked about game theory, hospitals, and living authentically. I put the link to that in the chat. We do have, you got a lot of great feedback, Beth, in the chat, including one attendee said they really enjoyed the breakdown of Germany from someone who lived in Berlin for 6 months with a well-known sports brand. They found it difficult from a language barrier and having that breakdown with what they were building. So it taught them a lot, reminding that they're true engineers. Even if they move slow, they move with precision. And another comment was tying into the difference in different countries. So I also want to highlight the value of learning this is I hope it opens up everyone's mind to realize if you want to work in a global ecosystem, you really need to invest in learning the culture and how they work in the country that you're working with. This individual is a vice chairman of a Europa Bio and found the range very revealing. They pointed out that each European country is somewhat different in the terms of the metrics. They built four companies in the UK, which are closer to the US. Ireland is also closer, but France is a very different animal, but closer to the US. Scandinavia,
Absolutely.
yeah, Scandinavia and Southern Europe are closer to Germany as well. And then the one question that we do have outside of all of those kudos is the question of, is U.S. health administration cost higher due to complex government regulation requirements, or is it tied to something else?
No, it's not really tied to the complex government regulation, because as I said, even data protection and privacy in European markets is so much more extensive than it is in the United States. We tend to atomize things, and we fractionalize our workforce. So if you, it's maddening sometimes. If you ask someone a question, they're in the United States and in the healthcare industry, they're extremely friendly, but not always helpful because they view their task as too limited. You have a little bit more of that generalism. People own a process in European markets because that's the way by not differentiating between all of these different areas, you don't create the shortage, you don't create the extensive cost. So that's a lot of it. And we expect a lot more of the customer is king in American healthcare. That's the other part of it. It's kind of the good part. So you have a lot more of the touchy-feely in the United States, but you have the average number of people that will see you in a German hospital is maybe three. So, and the average number of people that will see you in an American hospital, starting from the hospitalist to the discharge management, is approximately 14. So, this is what we're talking about. It's that attitude about owning a process rather than creating or eliminating a task.
Amazing. Well, that was great. Thank you so much. We know you're super busy because, as you mentioned, you're at the airport right now. So, thank you so much for taking the time to share this important talk with us. And for those heard, Dr. Harrison is the chair of the Biomedical Engineering External Advisory Board for Georgia Tech and Emory. So, thank you for your volunteer and service in that category as well.
It's my pleasure and an honor. Thank you all very much.
Have a blessed day.